There's a total of 401 pieces in this lamp, which made it an extremely fun and challenging project. My name is Johnny Trombucas, and today I'd like to show you how I made this Kumiko epoxy pendant lamp. Kumiko is an ancient Japanese technique of assembling geometric patterns in wood without the use of metal fasteners. I tape all the strips together, that way I can cut them to the exact same length. And I'm starting with the main grid of the 4 panels needed for the lamp. Once they're all cut, I switch to this sled, which I made specifically to cut and space the half flaps in the grid work. There were a lot of half flaps to cut, and getting this right is the most important part of Kumiko as it sets you up for success in the future steps. Next, I cut 30-degree half flaps in the strips that will make up the diamonds in the center section of the panel. These are the small cross pieces in the angled grid, and with these done, I move on to cut the center half flap in the larger strips. Now I can use the small pieces as a template and mark out where I need to cut the half flaps in the larger strips so that they can intersect properly. This grid work is almost done, and the very last thing to do is to cut the half flaps that will connect this angled grid to the main grid. This is where a couple things can go wrong, because if I don't cut these half flaps exactly where they need to be, the grid can get distorted when it's assembled. So I'm being very careful to measure out where I need to make these cuts, and I'm using the grids themselves to mark out the proper locations. Also, these half flaps needed to be cut at 60 degrees. So I added this third fence to my sled. With the half flaps in the main grid cut, I can center the angled grid in those slots and mark out where I need to cut the intersecting half flaps. Off camera, I added some glue to some of these sections, and once it dried, I trimmed up the extra lengths of the strips with a handsaw. I glued this panel in specific sections at a time, that way it would be easier to access and trim off the extra lengths of the strips inside the grid. With the grids done, I move on to making their mitered frames using African mahogany. After cutting the first angle, I used the panels themselves to mark out the opposite side and cut that piece to length. With the first piece cut, I tape it in place and repeat that process for the rest of the frame. I'm cutting each frame piece specifically for each side of each panel. That way, if there's any differences between the panels, I still have a snug fitting frame. Once I'm happy with the fit of all the frames, I glue them together using the tape method. I also glue them to the Kumiko panels and add some tape to close up any gaps. Next up is the infill, and this is the fun but challenging part of making Kumiko. I'm using a few different Kumiko jigs to make the pattern that I want to incorporate into this lamp. Each jig helps me cut a different angle on all of these small infill pieces. I'm starting with these small sections on the top and bottom of the panel that will each get half of the Asanoha pattern. I covered how to make this pattern in another video, which is linked in the description. There you'll also find a link to Kumiko jigs and Kumiko starter kits, which are a great way to learn Kumiko and incorporate it in your own projects. With those half Sanohas done, I move on to the center section and first divide these diamonds into equilateral triangles. This section will also get the Asanoha pattern, but I use 30 and 60 degree jigs to reflect the angles in the grid. These pieces are extremely tiny, which made it a little more difficult to cut. They were just under half of an inch long at their final length. With the Kumiko panels done, I can move on to the epoxy. I cover some plywood with sheathing tape, which won't stick to the epoxy as it cures, and will allow me to easily remove the Kumiko panels later on. After hot gluing the panels down in place, I start by mixing the epoxy for the first pour. I did two separate pours, with the first one being clear and the second one is where I added color pigment. That way there's more light that can shine through the epoxy. There are a lot of tight pockets in this panel, and to get the epoxy down into those, I used a dental syringe. After the first layer enters its gel state, I mix up some more epoxy and start adding pigments. I used some blues and greens to get somewhat of a navy turquoise blend. Total Boat was kind enough to help out with this project and provide you with a coupon code. Use JTWood W10 at checkout and get 10% off any Total Boat product. You can grab anything from the 2-to-1 epoxy that I'm using here, all the way up to their brand new thick set deep casting epoxy, which I'm looking forward to trying out. I had to mix a few different batches of epoxy so I wouldn't have too much in the cup and risk the chance of it reaching its exothermic state too quickly and solidifying in the mixing cup. Because of that, I knew I would have different shades of blue for each batch. So I mixed up enough epoxy to fill in all the same pockets in each panel, and then repeated that until all the pockets were filled. I'm also only filling these pockets about halfway up, that way the Kumiko strips still create a little bit of a shadow line. Next, I added a chamfer on the back of the long sides and one of the short sides of the panels. I felt it would be more accurate to cut this on a router table, but I don't have one. So I flipped my router upside down and tightened it really well in the vise. I felt confident doing it this way, but I wouldn't advise it if it doesn't feel safe to you, as you have a very small platform to reference off of. Before adding glue to these chamfers, I hold the panels together with rubber bands to measure out the cross piece where the lamp cord will attach to. I cut this piece to length and used a stop block to accurately cut out the tenons. Next, I drilled a hole in the middle of this piece where the lamp head will come through, but the threads aren't long enough to reach through the entire piece of wood. So I drilled a larger hole halfway through so the entire lamp head can sit into it. While at the drill press, I also set up a fence so I can accurately drill out the majority of a mortise on top of two of these panels. Then cleaned up that mortise with a chisel. And sanded the front and back of the panels to even out any imperfections in the Kumiko pieces or the epoxy. Once that was all done, I can start gluing it all together, and I first glue in the section that will hold the lamp cord. Next, I add some glue on the chamfers, and using clamps to hold these pieces together would have been a little tricky, so instead I used rubber bands. A lot of rubber bands. Once the glue had enough time to dry, I can remove any dust and add a couple coats of spray lacquer, mainly focusing on the mahogany to bring out that rich orange color. With that dry, I attached the cord, added a bulb, and hung it in its final home. While I was pouring the epoxy, I made the decision to not add any blue epoxy in the diamonds. That way more light can shine through and highlight the warm wood tones against the cold blue epoxy. This Kumiko and epoxy process is something that I'll be exploring more of in the future. If you want to stay up to date with those projects, you can join me over on Instagram. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.